What if the royal escape to America was never legal to begin with? Let that sink in for a second. Because tonight, the story isn't about palace gossip, Netflix deals, or celebrity feuds. It's about paperwork. Cold, unforgiving paperwork. The kind that doesn't care about titles, trauma, or carefully curated victim narratives. The kind that can quietly unravel an entire life built in front of cameras. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the shocking part. While the world watched Meghan and Harry reinvent themselves as exiled royals turned American power players, something far less glamorous was ticking in the background. A visa, a temporary permission slip. And now, that slip may be the very thing pulling the floor out from under them. Ask yourself this. How does a foreign prince with no traditional job, no employer, and no permanent residency suddenly build a life in the United States without questions being asked? For years, no one pushed too hard. Fame has a way of dulling scrutiny. But scrutiny always comes back. And when it does, it comes with receipts. This story matters now because the silence is gone. Lawsuits have teeth. Court filings don't bend for PR. And political figures don't whisper when they smell weakness. What once felt untouchable suddenly looks exposed. Very exposed. Behind the glossy interviews and staged confidence, something else has been brewing. Reports of panic. Legal scrambling. A realization that the American dream they sold the world might rest on a foundation that was never as solid as it appeared. Meghan, once unshakable in front of cameras, allegedly breaking down behind closed doors. Harry, the prince who ran from royal rules, now boxed in by American law. There's an irony here that's impossible to ignore. The couple who accused institutions of cruelty now facing an institution that doesn't care about feelings at all. Immigration law doesn't clap back. It doesn't explain itself. It simply acts. And then came the trigger. A lawsuit. Not flashy. Not viral. Just persistent. It asked one uncomfortable question that no one could dodge anymore. Was everything disclosed? Was everything truthful? And if not, what happens next? This is where the story turns from rumor to risk. Because when legal language replaces public sympathy, the game changes. And when political power enters the room, it changes again. Here's what should make you pause. This isn't about deportation headlines yet. It's about admissions already made. Statements already published. Words Harry himself put into the world, believing they would never be examined under oath. But what if they are? Because the most dangerous part of this entire saga isn't what Donald Trump allegedly wants to do. It's what Harry may have already done years ago, in plain sight, thinking no one would ever connect the dots. And once those dots are connected, there's no undoing it. So let's talk about the thing that built this entire American chapter and might now destroy it. Because every fairy tale has paperwork, and this one came with a visa that was never meant to carry this much weight. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people skipped over. Prince Harry didn't just move to America because he wanted to. He had to be allowed to. And that permission didn't come from sympathy, trauma, or royal titles. It came from a specific immigration category with very specific rules. The O-1 visa. Think of the O-1 like Hollywood's velvet rope. It's not citizenship. It's not a green card. It's a temporary pass reserved for people with extraordinary ability. Athletes, scientists, performers, people whose presence is considered valuable enough to justify an exception. Now ask yourself this. Extraordinary at what exactly? Harry isn't an actor. He isn't a musician. He doesn't have a traditional employer. His fame comes from birth, not achievement. And while fame can open doors, immigration law is supposed to ask follow-up questions. Who is sponsoring you? What are you doing? How long are you staying? And most importantly, are you telling the truth? For a while, no one seemed interested in those answers. The couple arrived during a cultural moment when criticism was risky. Questioning their narrative meant being labeled cruel, racist, or regressive. So institutions stayed quiet. Agencies didn't push, and the public assumed everything was above board. But here's where the contradiction creeps in. To qualify for an O-1, applicants must disclose past behavior that could impact eligibility, including drug use, including admissions already made publicly. And years later, Harry himself published words that suddenly looked very different when read through a legal lens instead of a sympathetic one. That's the part no one expected to matter. Because books are branding tools. until they become evidence. Did Harry assume honesty would be applauded? Did he believe his status insulated him? Or did no one warn him that immigration forms don't care about context, intent, or personal growth? Ask yourself this. If an ordinary person admitted the same things, would they still be here? That question is exactly why this story exploded. Not because of hate, not because of politics, but because consistency matters in law. And when public statements clash with sworn declarations, the system doesn't look away. It zooms in. Behind the scenes, pressure started building. Lawyers revisiting timelines. Opponents rereading interviews. Observers asking why this visa was never scrutinized before. And once that door opened, it couldn't be shut again. This is where the dream begins to wobble. Because the O-1 visa isn't permanent. It has conditions. It can be revoked. And it relies heavily on trust. Trust that what you said then matches what you admit now. And here's the chilling part. The visa itself may not be the real problem. The real problem is that once someone asks the right legal question, the answer doesn't belong to Harry anymore. It belongs to the courts. And the moment that happened, this stopped being a quiet immigration technicality and became something far more dangerous, a lawsuit that refused to go away. Because the next chapter isn't about what Harry needed to qualify. It's about who demanded to see the proof and why they wouldn't stop pushing until everything was exposed. This is where everything shifted, quietly at first, then all at once. Because lawsuits don't care about reputations. They care about inconsistencies. What started as a background murmur suddenly snapped into focus when one legal challenge refused to be brushed aside. No press tour could drown it out. No carefully worded statement could make it disappear. This lawsuit wasn't asking for sympathy. It was asking for documents. Here's the uncomfortable reality. When a case enters the legal system, it drags everything with it. Timelines, applications, declarations, and most dangerously of all, comparisons. What was said publicly versus what was sworn privately. What was admitted casually versus what was certified as true. Ask yourself this. Why fight so hard if there's nothing to hide? Because that's the question critics started asking when resistance appeared almost immediately. Requests for transparency were met with pushback. Delays. Legal maneuvering. The kind that signals panic, not confidence. The kind that makes people wonder what exactly might surface if the curtain is pulled back. This lawsuit didn't accuse. It investigated. And that's far more dangerous. As filings moved forward, something became clear. The issue wasn't just whether Harry qualified for his visa. It was whether the process had been handled consistently, whether rules were bent, whether fame softened scrutiny, and whether the system had been played, intentionally or not. Behind closed doors, the pressure reportedly skyrocketed. Legal teams scrambled. Old interviews were dissected line by line. A memoir once praised for its raw honesty suddenly looked like a liability. Not because of what it revealed emotionally, but because of what it might contradict legally. And here's the irony that stunned even seasoned observers. The very openness that helped sell books and headlines now threatened to undo everything. Honesty, once framed as bravery, became a potential problem when measured against immigration standards that demand precision, not storytelling. Meanwhile, Meghan's role began to draw attention, not as a defendant, not officially, but as a presence. Sources whispered about emotional strain, about frustration, about the realization that no amount of branding can outpace legal process. When a system starts moving, it doesn't stop to ask how you feel about it. And then came the escalation. Because lawsuits don't exist in isolation. They attract attention, and attention attracts power. Political voices began circling. Media narratives hardened. What was once a technical question became a cultural debate. Fairness, equality, special treatment. Ask yourself this. If the rules apply to everyone, should they apply here too? That question is what turned a legal dispute into a national conversation. And it's what opened the door for someone with a microphone, a platform, and a long memory to step in. Because the moment a political heavyweight entered the discussion, this stopped being about documents alone. It became about precedent. And the next move didn't come from a courtroom filing. It came from a name that guarantees chaos every time it enters the spotlight. Because once Donald Trump spoke up, the ground under this case didn't just shake. It cracked. And what came next would turn a legal headache into a full-blown storm no one could control. And this is the moment everything stopped being quiet. Because once Donald Trump entered the conversation, this was no longer just a lawsuit or an immigration technicality. It became a signal. A flare shot into the sky that told everyone watching, this is fair game now. Here's the thing about Trump. He doesn't drift into stories by accident. When he speaks, it's rarely subtle and never neutral. So when his name became attached to Harry's visa situation, the reaction was instant. Supporters saw accountability. Critics saw retaliation. But behind the noise, something far more important happened. The pressure shifted. Ask yourself this. Why would a former president even comment on a prince's visa unless he believed the ground was already unstable? Because Trump didn't create the issue. He amplified it. He took a legal question that had been simmering in court filings and dragged it into the public square, where institutions suddenly feel watched, where agencies feel scrutinized, where doing nothing starts to look like choosing sides. And that's dangerous. Reports began circulating that Trump viewed the situation not as personal revenge, but as precedent. One rulebook, one standard, no exceptions. Whether you love him or hate him, that framing matters. Because once fairness becomes the headline, silence becomes suspicious. Behind the scenes, the mood allegedly shifted from defensive to alarmed. This wasn't a blogger asking questions anymore. This wasn't a fringe lawsuit. This was a political spotlight burning hot enough to force action. Immigration authorities don't like attention. Courts don't like pressure. And when both feel it at once, something has to give. This is where Meghan's emotional state reportedly deteriorated. Not on camera, not in public, but privately. Because no amount of confidence training prepares you for the realization that the system you leaned on may now turn against you. That the country you framed as a sanctuary could become temporary overnight. Harry, meanwhile, faced a brutal irony. The man who spoke openly about his life, his struggles, his mistakes, now watching those same words dissected without mercy. Not by tabloids, but by people who speak in statutes and deadlines. Let this sink in. If the visa is revoked, this isn't a PR crisis. It's an existential one. Careers, residences, family stability. Everything suddenly becomes uncertain. And the scariest part? There's no royal protocol for this. No palace cushion. No diplomatic workaround. Ask yourself this. What happens when a prince becomes just another name on a file? That's the question hovering over everything now. Because Trump's involvement didn't guarantee an outcome. It guaranteed momentum. And momentum is what forces decisions that were once comfortably delayed. But here's the twist no one expected. The most dangerous move hasn't been made yet. Because the next step doesn't belong to Trump, the media, or even the lawsuit's original challengers. It belongs to the system itself. And once that system decides whether to act, there's no walking it back. Because buried in those records is one final detail. One confirmation. One answer that could flip this entire story from controversy to consequence. And when that answer surfaces, it won't just determine where Harry lives. It will decide whether this American chapter was ever real at all. So now we're at the edge of the cliff. And this is where the story stops being speculative and starts becoming deeply personal. Because strip away the headlines, the politics, the noise, and what you're left with is a single, unsettling question. What happens if the system decides that none of this was supposed to last? Imagine it for a moment. Not as a prince, not as a symbol, but as a man who uprooted his life, crossed a Nagay and built a home, a brand, a family identity in a country that may now be telling him, your time is up. That's the emotional core no one can spin away. If the visa is revoked, this isn't about embarrassment. It's about displacement. It's about waking up one morning and realizing that the place you framed as freedom was conditional all along. That the safety you believed you'd secured could vanish with a single administrative decision. And here's the part that stings the most. This entire saga circles back to the very thing that launched Harry into the spotlight as a truth teller. His own words. Words praised as brave. Words sold as healing. Words that may now be weighed not by readers, but by officials asking whether honesty came at the wrong time, in the wrong form. Ask yourself this. Can truth still save you if it contradicts what you once signed? That's the contradiction at the heart of this story. A couple who built their brand on transparency, now facing a system that demands consistency, not catharsis. A man who rejected royal rigidity, now confronting American bureaucracy at its most unforgiving. And Meghan? Whether you see her as mastermind, supporter, or bystander, one thing is clear. This outcome affects everything. Their future, their children's stability, their ability to remain relevant in the very country that made them profitable. Tears, panic, denial. Whatever the truth behind closed doors, the stakes are no longer theoretical. This is where we return to the opening question. What if the American dream was never legal to begin with? Not because of malice, not because of conspiracy, but because fame sometimes outruns forms. Because institutions sometimes look the other way until they don't. And because the system always catches up eventually. Here's the sobering takeaway. Titles don't override law. Narratives don't replace documentation. And victimhood doesn't grant immunity. In the end, everyone answers to the same framework, even princes. But don't mistake this for an ending. Because the most important decision hasn't been announced yet. The ruling, the determination. The moment when everything shifts from could happen to is happening. When silence breaks. When paperwork becomes action. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If deportation isn't the end of their story, what does the beginning of the next chapter look like? Because once the system moves, there's no pause button. And what comes next may redefine not just where Harry lives, but who he becomes when the protection is finally gone.